In other business news now, political parties represented in Parliament are unanimous that the South African Defence Force needs more funding. The withdrawal of SANDF troops from the DRC has put the spotlight, on its shortcomings. That's despite the country being the biggest spender on defence on the continent. Daniel du Plessis, the director of one of South Africa's foremost defence companies, Milkor, discusses this with us. Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. A very important issue. It's rare that we find parliamentarians, particularly under GNU, being unanimous in this regard, but they are. So let's talk about what the removal of troops by the SANDF from the DRC tells us about the state of the military in the country.
Tumisang, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, you're correct in saying it's not often that we have unanimous defence committee on this particular factor that the infrastructure is actually degrading at a staggering rate. I think the withdrawal from the DRC essentially gave us an opportunity to refocus and essentially turn our attention to face the brutal facts surrounding the SANDF, the MODVA, and the surrounding security and the peacekeeping operations that the South African National Defence Force has to operate in. I think it's a good time to recuperate and stare the facts brutally in the face and not lose faith necessarily, but come up with feasible solutions to restructure the SANDF and essentially reevaluate the roles that we have to play within the continent and globally.
Restructure and re-evaluate. Where funding is concerned, what are we talking about here in terms of numbers for the South African Defence Force? Because we know that arsenal does not come cheap.
That's the main issue. Globally, we are seeing a trend in the market. Typically, governments are increasing the spend on defence equipment. You can understand with tensions quite high at the moment globally when it comes to regional conflicts, with the potential of escalation on the horizon. Many countries are taking proactive action, essentially, in upping their spending, essentially making sure that the defence force and the infrastructure equipment that they have at their disposal is to a modern standard and suits the modern combat environment to facilitate whatever operations they need to do, be it peacekeeping or other activities that they need to do. South Africa, in contrast, over the last 10 years, has actually seen a decline in the defence budget. Of that, also of late, there was a promise of about 1.5% of the GDP, which would have been a double increase, a 100% increase in the defence budget, essentially paving the way forward for a revitalization of many of the old, outdated equipment that have been in service in the SANDF for more than 30 years. Quite a crucial factor. You cannot assist with peacekeeping operations on a regional front with equipment that is more than 30 years old.
Absolutely. Right? And is that what South Africa is sitting with, archaic equipment? That's
exactly it. South Africa has had a rich history, publicly and privately owned companies combined, essentially, owning a lot of the in-country manufacturing capabilities, which offers a long-term solution to the SANDF when it comes to longevity and operational support in these systems. However, many of these systems, for example, have not been upgraded or modernized at all within the last 30 years due to a lack of funding. Out of the 0.8% of the GDP budget, which is roughly about 60 billion rand, 65% of that goes to just maintaining the SANDF force as a whole, to salaries and certain things. That essentially leaves little to no budget for force planning. And although the SANDF members and members of the Executive Council within the SANDF, whom I engage with on a regular basis, have big ambitions and huge priorities set forth, their constraints from a parliamentary side and a government side in the spending of this budget and the increase or the lack of the increase thereof limits them completely. So hearing that the Parliamentary Committee, a Joint Standing Committee on Defence and Security, essentially being unanimous in their decision is a huge positive, in my opinion. However, there needs to be action towards, right? An increase in the budget is desperately needed. Not only are we losing valuable soldiers with valuable skills, with a sound doctrine implemented into the SANDF for domestic security, sovereignty security, as well as regional peacekeeping operations indoctrined into everyone in the SANDF. We are losing valuable members of the SANDF. But in the same process, we're also not equipping them with the necessary skills and equipment that they need to conduct their operations and their mandates effectively.
There are, though, two sides to this coin, because on the one side, there's an argument that we really can't put a price on the security of the country. But at the same time, there could be a counter-argument that then says, with the economic challenges where inequality, poverty and the likes are concerned in South Africa, why would we need a restructured budget that is going to be far more than what it could be dispensed elsewhere? How would you respond to that level of criticism as industry?
It's a very good question and a very compelling argument on both sides, right? And my stance on that is to address these social economic issues and the equality that is raging among the country, from unemployment to job creations to a multitude of things that needs to be corrected. There are many of these instances which needs to be driven by a thriving economy, right? In order to get a thriving economy, there needs to be stability within a country for an increased foreign investment, for stronger political ties, and a safe environment for citizens to operate within. What people do not often realize is that many of these regional peacekeeping efforts that the SANDF is involved in, we might think of it as a far distant land, but it's actually not that far. In recent times, there's been South African troops deployed to Cabo Delgado, which is in the northern province of Mozambique, our next door neighbor. We've seen last year in December, especially over Easter as well, with a raging protest action inside that country on our doorstep, on our border. So my response to that would essentially be, without proper security, and this counts not just for the SANDF, also the recently established BMA and the SAPS, equipping them with the necessary equipment, skills, training, and environment and operational support that they need to effectively conduct their mandate, essentially will drive a growing economy. Foreign investments, local businesses can thrive, and they can take their focus away from the internal security or regional security issues and then move on to it. In this process, the whole SANDF industry, both public and private, is essentially also world-renowned. Companies like Milkor, especially with developments like the Milkor 380, has essentially paved the way for a global presence and a global market stage. We have been involved in many different defense exhibitions globally, engaging with many different end users from different continents. And the defense industry in South Africa is definitely up to par with the world-leading standards. Many of the public citizens might not be aware of it, but most of these things are being exported either to the African continent or globally.
And that's where I want to come in and discuss how there is a call for further funding for the Defence Force, but at a localization level, could we, as South Africa, keep the value chain and the money in this country with a security and element of whether industry is prepared, capacitated, and can deliver some of the equipment that is required?
Yeah, there's the South African defence industry, and especially the critical skills retention within the industry from more than 40 years ago, essentially allows us to have a certain set of skills still available in the country. And there's a huge perception that many of these skills have been lost. If I take our company, for example, we have embarked on the biggest development of a UAV or unmanned aerial vehicle platform in the history of the African continent, producing essentially a leader among the top 10 UAVs globally. We have done that solely with South African skills. Yes, we had to fight quite hard to remain and keep this capability within the country based in Cape Town, but this is still an available skill, and our company is one of many examples within the South African defense industry that essentially uses local talent and recruiting upcoming talent from top universities in South Africa, enabling them to essentially keep to the market trends in developing future technologies. And we're quite proud of that fact, and like I said, we are not the only ones doing this.
We can only look forward to the tide turning in this regard. Thank you so much for your time. Daniel du Plessis is the director at Milkor, talking to us this afternoon about a call that's been made for funding for the South African National Defence Force.